I want to tell the story of something most Americans never really hear about, even though it sits right at the center of war, peace, and presidential power. We all know the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, and yet here's the first big fact in this story. Congress has not formally declared war since World War II. This is not an opinion. This is the official historical reality. Since World War II, America has increasingly moved away from formal declarations of war towards something else. Things like joint resolutions, authorizations, funding measures, and presidential action under claimed commander-in-chief authority. And that shift matters because once you stop requiring formal declaration, it becomes easier for war to become politically fuzzy. It becomes easier for Congress to say, well, hey, we supported the mission. And presidents then say, well, Congress gave me the authority. And somewhere in that fog, accountability starts to disappear. The first major post-war example is actually Korea. In 1950, President Harry Truman sent American forces into the Korean conflict, but he did not ask Congress for a formal declaration of war. According to the National Archives, Truman treated Korea officially as a UN police action, quote unquote. And that's important because it showed future presidents that major military conflict could happen without Congress using its clearest constitutional language. Now then came the first wave of Cold War joint resolutions. In 1955, Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, Public Law 84-4. That joint resolution authorized President Eisenhower to employ U.S. armed forces as he deemed necessary to protect Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and the Pescadores. Notice the pattern, though. Not a declaration of war, but a statutory green light for the president to use force in a defined geopolitical crisis. 2 years later, in 1957, Congress passed another joint resolution, Public Law 85-7, often tied to the Eisenhower Doctrine. It authorized the president to cooperate and assist nations in the Middle East and created a framework for U.S. military involvement there. Sound familiar? Again, it's the same pattern. Congress was still involved, but not through a formal declaration of war. Then in 1962, during the Cuba crisis era, Congress passed Public Law 87-733, which is called the Cuba Resolution. It declared that the United States was determined to prevent the Marxist-Leninist regime in Cuba from extending its aggressive or subversive activities in the hemisphere, and it used sweeping language about stopping that threat, quote, by whatever means may be necessary, including the use of arms. That is not a modern AUMF in the narrow sense, but it absolutely shows that Congress was moving toward broader, force-friendly resolutions rather than formal war declarations. And then we arrive at the most infamous example of all. This is Vietnam. In 1964, after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Public Law 88-408. This is the resolution that helped transform a limited American posture into a full-scale war. The text said that the United States was prepared to take, again, quote, all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist in Southeast Asia. The language was broad, and presidents treated it as broad. And this is where the danger of the joint resolution era comes into full view. Congress had not declared war, but it had effectively handed over enormous war-making space to the executive branch. And later, many in Congress would come to regret it. In fact, the Senate's own historical materials note that Congress rescinded the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 1971, though funding for the war continued until U.S. forces withdrew in 1973. In other words, Congress learned the hard way that a joint resolution can become a political blank check. Now, that regret led to the next major chapter, the famed and often talked about, especially right now, War Powers Resolution of 1973. This was Congress trying to claw back authority. The War Powers Resolution states that the president's power to introduce U.S. forces into hostilities should be exercised only pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by attack on the United States, its territories, possessions, or armed forces. And it also created the reporting requirements and the famous 60-day framework that still shows up every time presidents use force abroad, including now with the strikes on Iran. So after years of drift, Congress tried to reassert the constitutional balance, but it didn't stop the drift. In 1981, Congress passed the Multinational Force and Observers Participation Resolution, authorizing U.S. participation in the Sinai peacekeeping framework that was tied to the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. This was not a broad war authorization, but still another example of Congress using a joint resolution to approve military participation short of a declared war. In 1983, Congress passed the Multinational Force in Lebanon Resolution, Public Law 98-119, which explicitly served as statutory authorization under the War Powers Resolution for continued U.S. participation in the multinational force in Lebanon. And now you can see the evolution. Joint resolutions had become the practical mechanism for managing military commitments, even while the constitutional declaration of war power sat mostly unused. Then came 1991 and the first Gulf War. Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution, Public Law 102-1. This is what powered Desert Storm. Again, it was not a formal declaration of war. It was a joint resolution authorizing force against Iraq pursuant to UN Security Council resolutions after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. This is one reason people often say Desert Storm was authorized by Congress, but not declared as a war in the old constitutional sense. Now you fast forward from here to September 11, 2001. Congress passed perhaps the most consequential joint resolution of the modern era, the 2001 AUMF Public Law 107-40. That law authorized the president to use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for the 9/11 attacks and those who harbored them. And here's the stunning part. According to current compiled text, that 2001 authorization has not been amended in any way. It became the legal foundation then for military operations across multiple countries, across multiple presidencies. One joint resolution passed in the smoke of 9/11 has echoed for decades. Now then, not even a year later in 2002, Congress passed yet another Iraq authorization. This was called the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution of 2002, Public Law 107-243. This became the legal basis for the 2003 Iraq invasion. Once again, no formal declaration of war, but a joint resolution conferring major war-making authority on the president. So what is the larger story? Larger story is that after World War II, Congress did not simply stop caring about war, but it changed the way it participated in war. Instead of issuing formal declarations, it increasingly used joint resolutions and other statutory authorizations. In some cases, like Tonkin, those authorizations proved dangerously broad. In other cases, like the War Powers Resolution, Congress tried to restrain presidential power. But over time, the practical result has been clear. The center of gravity in war-making has moved away from formal declarations and toward a murkier system of authorizations, appropriations, and executive initiative. And maybe this is the question that Americans should be asking. Not simply, did Congress vote on this, but more to the point, what exactly did Congress vote for, if anything? Did Congress declare war? Did it narrowly authorize a mission? Did it hand over a blank check? Did it try to limit the president, or did it quietly let the executive branch take the wheel? Because the history of congressional joint resolutions is really the history of how America learned to go to war without fully saying the words. And that should concern every American, no matter their politics. We're talking about blaming President Donald Trump for acting unconstitutionally and sending Americans to war in Iran. Maybe he did, but he is claiming a power that Congress has allowed presidents to use for the past 80 years. That doesn't make it right, does it make it wrong, does it make it right, according to the Constitution? Our interpretations clearly differ from Congress because Congress is sitting on their thumbs right now. And why? You have to wonder why. Maybe we need to stop blaming presidents so much because they're just using the power. And I mean they, because it's not just Donald Trump. It was Obama. He levied strikes on countries. Of course, we know George W. Bush did the same thing. But going back presidents all the way, and I just walked you through from Truman forward, since World War II, this has been going on. And we have to ask the question, maybe not why is the president acting unconstitutionally, but why isn't Congress doing their job to protect the Constitution if the president is in fact behaving in an unconstitutional manner? These are questions we need to sort out. Why hasn't Congress had the backbone to pass a declaration of war in 80 years? We've certainly been in war after war after war, but all without a declaration. Why has Congress been content to sit back and allow this to happen? The malfunction, as I look at history, is not necessarily in the executive branch. The executive branch is taking advantage of the power it's being allowed to use. Now, I didn't say the power that it has, the power it's being allowed to use. This is like with our kids. They're going to go as far as we let them go. Congress is not doing its job setting the boundaries for the limits of presidential power. They're sitting by and watching it. Maybe this isn't so much a case of presidential largesse when it comes to war powers, as much as it might be congressional cowardice to actually put their name on a dotted line and declare war if they know one is happening. We're going to have to sort this out. Again, I hope this helps you. I hope this gives you some context into what's going on, what's happening here in Iran. I'm not arguing that Iran's regime was evil and should be displaced, but that's a different conversation. If we're going to have the constitutional conversation, we need to go back all the way to when we became unmoored from the constitutional declaration of war powers in the first place. And that didn't start with Trump. That started all the way back with Korea.